Good morning and welcome to the 80th Learn with Lorna, where we will be looking at the subject of whisky. I'll wait a few minutes for people to join as usual, but in the meantime please tell me where you are and where you're watching from, and I will preface this immediately by saying that as anyone who knows me will know, I don't drink any alcohol, so if I don't have personal knowledge of whisky, that's I'm sorry. So please do share your own whisky tips and hints in the chat. Hi Jenny, nice to have you back. It was very odd not having you live. Hi Stuart, Tanya. Okay, so welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. As I say, we're on to the 80th in this series, which is extraordinary. Let me know how many of them you've watched. My name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, and for anyone who doesn't know, the Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, Skye and Lochalsh Archive Centre in Portree, and Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archive Centre in Wick. And together the 4 of them make up the archive service and look after historic documents for the whole of the Highlands. And then we do all sorts of things to share them, such as this series. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland, our parent organisation, at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you're able to donate towards our work and enable us to keep doing things like that, then please do so. We're very, very grateful for that. And there's a link to be able to do so in the text of this, whether you're watching live on Facebook or whether you're subsequently watching on YouTube. I really enjoyed September's theme. I hope other people did. We got lots of interesting comments, lots of really nice stories as well. September we were looking at life stories, sharing the personal stories of individuals and also institutions, and that was really a really good thing to do and really well appreciated, I think. We're moving now into October's theme, which is food and drink, and we're starting with probably the drink most associated with Scotland, apart from Iron Brew perhaps, and that is whisky. Whisky, of course, is so much a part of the image of Scotland, and perhaps particularly the image of the Highlands and Islands, and of course our neighbouring local authority Moray, which Moray has about half of all of Scotland's 130 plus distilleries. So this part of the world where we are is well provisioned with whisky and distilleries. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of what whisky is, what's its story, and then what do our collections tell us about it. Well, the word whisky, as some of you will know, comes from the Gaelic Ushgabeha, which is translates as the water of life, and the water bit is very important, as we'll see, which is why Moray and Highland have so many distilleries. Whisky is essentially a distilled spirit which is made from cereals, particularly barley, water and yeast, and as I say, water, the ushka bit in that Gaelic name. In order to be called Scotch whisky, then it is stipulated in law, both UK law and EU law, that the spirit, the drink that is made, has to be matured for at least 3 years in Scotland, and without that part then it can be called whisky, but it can't be called Scotch whisky. 3 years is that minimum, but in practice it's often much longer that it's matured for. So I mentioned there that there are cereals, there's yeast, there's water, particularly barley among the cereals. So very few ingredients really, but not a simple process. So it sounds like it would be a very simple drink to make, but it's a long and considered process, and one which has been perfected and developed over hundreds of years. Now, as I say, I don't drink, so please forgive me if I get some of these facts wrong, but from what I believe to be the case, very simply, whisky can be split into malt whiskies, grain whiskies and blended whiskies. Malt being made with those very simple basic ingredients, barley, water and yeast. Grain whiskies then made with barley, water and yeast, and usually another cereal, so often wheat or corn. And then blended whiskies are a mix of the two. The purpose being to soften the kind of very strong taste of a malt whisky. And blended whiskies came about in the 1860s, and now they account for over 90% of the bottles drunk around the world. I mentioned there that in order to be called Scotch whisky, then whisky has to be distilled or matured, for 3 years in Scotland. And so there are various laws surrounding what constitutes Scotch whisky. There are also various pieces of legislation regulating the standard of the drink, of course, as you would expect, such as requirements for malt whisky to be made in pot stills. And pot stills are those very iconic copper pieces of apparatus that you think of if you picture a distillery. Probably you'll picture those big copper stills. And so that's essentially what whisky is. And apparently, one of my favourite facts I came across while researching this one, apparently there are around 42 bottles a second exported from Scotland, which is quite extraordinary. So let me know if you're responsible for any of those being exported. So where does the story start? Where does the story of whisky begin, and why is it so central to the culture of Scotland and to the image of Scotland? And I thought that probably the best thing to do would be to defer to the Scotch Whisky Association, which was established in 1912, and read you part of their summary of the story of whisky. And so I'll read this to you, and if you want more information about whisky, the history of it, the development process, then I would really recommend you have a look at the Scotch Whisky Association website. It has all sorts of interesting information, timelines and videos about the process of distilling whisky. And so they record it like this. The story of Scotch begins as early as the 15th century. The earliest documented record of distilling in Scotland occurred in 1494 in the tax records of the day, the Exchequer Rolls. An entry lists 8 bowls of malt to Friar John Core, wherewith to make aquavita. And Friar John was in luck. This was enough malted barley to produce almost 1,500 bottles of a potent spirit which would be refined and improved in the years ahead. The increasing popularity of Scotch attracted the attention of the Scottish Parliament, looking to profit from the fledgling industry. The first taxes on Scotch were introduced in 1644, which led to an increase in illicit whisky distilling across Scotland. Smuggling became standard practice for the next 150 years. The excise men, or the gaugers as they were known, and the illicit distillers began a game of cat and mouse, with canny Scots coming up with increasingly ingenious ways of shielding the spirit from taxation. Even usually honest members of the clergy would hide Scotch under the pulpit, and the illicit spirit was even transported by coffin to avoid the taxman. By the 1820s, as many as 14,000 illicit stills were being confiscated every year, and more than half the whisky consumed in Scotland was being enjoyed without the taxman taking his cut. The continued flouting of the law eventually prompted the Duke of Gordon, on whose extensive land some of the finest illicit whisky in Scotland was being produced, to propose in the House of Lords that the government should instead make it profitable to produce whisky legally. In 1823, the Excise Act was passed, which sanctioned the distilling of whisky in return for a licence fee of £10 and a set payment per gallon of proof spirit. Smuggling died out almost completely over the next decade, and in fact a great many of the present-day distilleries stand on sites used by the smugglers over 2 centuries ago. Until this point, the spirit, illicit or otherwise, had been malt whisky, but in 1831 Aeneas Coffey invented the patent still, which enabled a continuous process of distillation to take place, and this led to the production of grain whisky, a different, less intense spirit than malt whisky. The lighter, flavoured grain whisky, when blended with the more potent and fiery malts, extended the appeal of Scotch whisky to a considerably wider market. And so that's the kind of background of where that came from, the fact that it was illegal. 14,000 illicit stills being confiscated a year, until somebody went, why don't we just make this legal, and then we can, the government can make a profit from it and we'll get rid of the smuggling situation. And so it has flourished ever since. Even in the United States Prohibition, whisky was allowed if you could prove that it was on medical grounds, and apparently that website informed me that Winston Churchill was one of those who claimed he needed it for medicinal purposes. So that's some of the background of the subject, that the story of whisky covered in 10 minutes. So what documents do we have in the Highland Archive Service collections that tell us about this story and how it played out in the Highlands? Well, whisky appears in various collections. We hold court process papers which record the discovery of the illicit stills and those smugglers that were mentioned. We hold maps and photographs that show locations of distilleries. We hold reference to whisky consumption in our family and estate records, so for instance butlers' books and so on, but also in our police collections and other documents that talk about the impact of alcohol, such as the church records, where there's one fantastic example from Kirkhill that talks about people being so drunk and had so much whisky that they looked like they'd been drawn through the ground, looked like they'd been drawn through the mud because they were so out of control. So there are references across all our collections, and I'll come back to the reasons for that shortly, which is just that whisky is an integral part of celebrations, events, funerals, christenings, weddings, so much of life, and therefore it crops up in these records. But we're going to start first of all by looking at the statistical accounts. The statistical accounts, which I have mentioned numerous times, were summaries of each parish in Scotland, done in the first one in the late 1700s and the second one in the 1840s-ish, the third one in the 20th century, where each parish would have a summary written about it, about its educational state, its industry, and so on. And the statistical accounts are full of references to whisky, both the distilling of it and the drinking of it. And one of the things that statistical accounts focused on was the industries that were occupying people in each parish. And so there are numerous references to distilleries. So for instance, the first statistical account, the 1794 for Kiltarlity, notes that there were 8 licensed distilleries in the premise at that point, distilling around 2,496 balls of barley per year, which were going on to be sold to whisky retailers in Lochaber, Kintail and various other places. So you can see that in the late 1700s there are references there to the impact that whisky producing is having on the local economy. The 1793 statistical account for Urquhart is particularly interesting because it includes the really interesting story of the Ferrintosh distillery in Ross and Cromarty, which was the first legal distillery in Scotland. So in that first bit I read to you, where there was the turn of these smugglers, the illicit stills, and then them basically giving in and saying, let's make this a legal process. And so the Ferrintosh distillery was the first legal distillery in Scotland. And the Forbes of Culloden family, who I have mentioned several times, a particularly interesting family, were given the privilege by the government of distilling on their Ferrintosh estate free from that payment of excise duty. They were given that in as a kind of reward for political allegiance. They were given the privilege of distilling whisky on their Ferrintosh estate without having to pay those excise fees, and it was given extraordinarily, that the right was given in perpetuity. And this meant that loads of people moved into the area to work at the distillery, which apparently produced 2/3 of Scotland's whisky in the mid-1700s. And the statistical account gives an account of what happened when that privilege, which you'll remember had been given in perpetuity in the 1600s, when it was removed. It had been given in 1690, potentially forever, but it was removed in the 1780s. And you can see in the statistical account what an impact this had on the local area. And it was removed as part of industry regulation and the fact that it was in really stopping anyone else from being able to compete in the market. And so this is what the account says. Upon the extinction of this right, many of the people, being deprived of employment, were obliged to seek elsewhere for that support which they had no expectation that the place could any longer afford. And in a little time thereafter, the inhabitants of the parish were found to have decreased some hundreds in number. So loads of people moving away from the parish after that right of free distilling without duty was removed. Few of them, however, left the kingdom. Their supposed superior skill in the business to which they had been inured occasioned a demand of hands from Ferintosh wherever distilleries were erected under the new Act of Parliament, respecting that branch of revenue which took place at about the same time as the deprivation of their own privilege. So because the law had been passed and that there was more competition allowed, even though they had lost the privilege to be able to have this duty-free distilling in Ferintosh, they had acquired such skill that they were in demand in other places. So many of them left the parish, but they didn't leave the country. This decrease of inhabitants ceased, however, in the course of 2 to 3 years after the event to which it had been owing. Since that time, the population of the place has been uniformly advancing, and amounts at present to little short of what it had been in any other former period. The extent to which their original occupation, though stripped of its former advantages, is now again carried on, partly occasions this returning increase in population. So people are coming back to work in Ferintosh, even though they don't have that privilege anymore. They're starting to come back and work in distilling again. And it does go on to say that there are more stills being established. But it also describes the fact that this impact didn't only affect the people who worked in distilling firsthand, it also affected the entire wider community. So the people of that parish so it says that it was not solely the population of the parish that was affected by the resuming of the Ferintosh privilege. The people of that district, who constitute the great body of the parish, underwent in general a great deterioration as to their circumstances and mode of living from that event, against which few of them had made any provision. So they had thought, because this right was granted in perpetuity, that they would always be able to live a slightly better quality of life, and hadn't bothered to put any money aside, hadn't bothered to save anything. And so when that was removed from them, they suddenly found themselves in desperation. The monopoly that they had enjoyed and the acknowledged superiority of the spirits produced from their small still occasioned a demand for them from all quarters, and a constant circulation of cash in the place, which brought the people in general an ease in their circumstances and a fullness of the necessaries of life beyond what commonly falls to the class of farmers. So they had been very well off. But then it says that there was suddenly a transition in all of those things to the level of their neighbours, and it was so abrupt that they suddenly found themselves without anything. But it does go on to say that it would have been more severely felt if the distinguished humanity of the proprietor of the lands had not been felt. So obviously the landowner had been quite compassionate about it. But it finishes that the business of distillation is now resumed in Ferintosh and diffused throughout the parish in general, to an extent that requires a very considerable annual importation of barley and gives employment to 29 licensed stills. There are, however, very few who derive any benefit from it, but the mischief resulting from it is manifest, and there is too much cause to apprehend, from the low price of spirits and the restriction as to the foreign market, that the country in general may furnish multiplied instances of pernicious tendencies in this trade. It is an outlet to intemperance and a bane to the industry and the morals of the people. So they have stills back, which is giving some people work, but is causing all sorts of problems with the morals and behaviour of the people. And following on from that, of course, whisky makes an appearance in our court records. For instance, we hold this justiciary warrant of commitment against William Mackay. He's been found in possession of smuggled whisky and also has been accused of assault on excise officers in 1820. This is from our High Court papers. 2 excise officers, accompanied by 2 soldiers of the 42nd Regiment of Foot, went to the village of Clachnahary to watch for smuggled whisky, which they expected to be conveyed in the course of the night into the town of Inverness. And after remaining on the side of the road for about 3 hours, 2 horses came up from the west, conveying 3 casks of whisky and attended by 8 men, of which whisky the officers made lawful seizure, and having intended to convey it to the excise office at Inverness, they proceeded on the road for that purpose. So they've caught the people smuggling it, they've confiscated it, but at the west end of the village of Clachnahary, they were attacked by the smugglers, who threw stones at them and attempted to rescue the whisky. Under attack from the smugglers, the excise party secured the whisky in an empty house in Clachnahary, The house itself was then attacked by the smugglers, who eventually broke in through the door and the windows, assaulted the excise party, retrieved their whisky and horses, and made off into the night. And this is the warrant to arrest them. And it goes on to say that William Mackay, son of Donald Mackay, residing at Corrie of Ardnacrask in the parish of Urry in the county of Ross, was one of the persons principally concerned in this outrage, and he is skulking in different jurisdictions to prevent the execution of any warrant against him. So they know who it is, but he's hiding. But really just a classic document from within the court papers. There are many kind of similar ones, but just such an insight into it's such a cinematic description, I think, of them waiting in the night, the horses coming by with the barrels on it. They get them, the smugglers throw stones, they hide it in an empty house, the smugglers break into the house and steal the whisky back. It's such a dramatic picture. And you can see why eventually they said, oh, for goodness sake, please let's just make this legal. This one is from 1834, and this time it's an extract of an evidence that was given by the Commissioner of Excise against John William and Alexander Fraser. This says that that on the morning of the 20th of March 1834, your petitioner, so that's the Commissioner speaking, detected John Fraser, William Fraser and Alexander Fraser in an illegal distillery in Wester Caplach in the county of Inverness, where your petitioner discovered 1 still, 1 head, 6 tons and 2 casks, 50 gallons of wash and 8 gallons of low wines, all of which was destroyed, and the above named persons were found superintending the distillery. So you get some idea there of the scale of that. A still, 6 tons, 2 casks, 50 gallons of wash, 8 gallons of low wines, which is wine, which is a stage of the distilling process. It's called low wines at a certain point of the distilling process. And as I say, these documents are all over, and I certainly have read one previously where the excise men were attacked and beaten. And so that one there, that each of those men, John, William and Alexander Fraser, were each fined £30 or 3 months imprisonment in the toll booth for having that illicit still. Sometimes the people found guilty of illicit distilling would petition the court for lenience. They would explain why they had done it and see if they could get any compassion from the court. This is a beautiful letter from our Baillie of Dunane collection. Some of you, if you watched when we did our Doors Open Day film, some of you may remember it because Alistair, my colleague, chose it as one of his favourite documents to talk about. And it was written by Alexander Mackenzie from Newton of Ferintosh. And it was written after he had been found in possession of illicit whisky in 1814. And this is his letter of his petition for compassion. Humbly sheweth, so he's writing to them to say, that Mr. James Hay, officer of excise in Ferintosh, have about the latter end of harvest last, found in the possession of your petitioner a small quantity of low wines, and that thereafter Collector Cochrane found a small quantity of whisky extracted from the said low wines. So he's admitting that he's been caught in possession of the whisky and of the low wines, so at various stages of the process. But he goes on to explain why he should be given some leniency. Your petitioner has poverty, 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 bad health, which is legible in his countenance, a throng and weak family, without a horse or a cow, a calf or a sow, a cart or a plough for supporting them, and is situated in a barren, bane, rough, ragged, rugged moor, without 1 inch of arable ground, where he built a house last year. He also some time ago was deprived of 3 children in the course of 1 month by the smallpox, which reduced your petitioner's scanty means, and his lady also. The foregoing misfortunes are indisputable facts. Your petitioner begs leave to conclude by appealing to the humanity of the honourable justices, and in the wisdom of their decision he trusts he may confide, and in this faith your petitioner as in duty bound shall ever pray. So going on to say, look how absolutely desperate I have poverty, 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 no animals, no livestock, no cart, no plough. I live in a desperate, rugged, ragged moor. I have no land that I can toil. I've lost 3 children because of smallpox. Please give me a little bit of compassion. And I don't know what happened in the end of that story. As I've said before, that's one of the banes of working with archives. Sometimes you don't get the full story. The 19th century was an important time in the story of whisky, so all of those extracts there that I've read from court papers are all from the 1800s, and it was an important time. As I mentioned, that was the development of blended whiskies came in at that point, and a boom in exports, and loads of distilleries were established at that point up and down the country. It's estimated that in the 1840s, Wick had over 40 licensed premises. So Wick alone, just the town of Wick, had 41 licensed premises where people were consuming over 800 gallons of whisky per week, around 5,000 bottles. And it was known as the nectar of Caithness. And it had been known as the nectar of Caithness for generations because it had played a role, as I said at the beginning, in those everyday events, in christenings and baptisms, marriage celebrations, wakes and funerals. It had been used as wages, so for instance we hold documents that talk of workers on the Caledonian Canal being paid in whisky. It had been used to celebrate, so big events and small events, so it's just such a part of everyday life. But in Caithness particularly, the reason it was known as the nectar of Caithness was not only had it played a part in all those day-to-day things, but it had also played a part in notable events such as the 1680 battle outside Wick, in which Lord Glenorchy packed a ship full of whisky and deliberately stranded it so that his enemies would find it, drink the whisky, and then be unable to fight him the next day. Our nucleus archives hold all sorts of records of Caithness's lost and some still existent distilleries, including the long lost, now lost Gerston distillery, for which they hold 19th century papers, photos and documents. And Gerston was built in Falkirk in 1795, closed in the 1870s, and then reopened briefly from the 1880s to 1914 under the name of Dunmorvan Distillery. But the reason I wanted to flag it was A, they hold some papers to do with it, but also a really interesting point that my colleague Belinda in Wick shared with me was that in 2013 the Lost Distillery Company had a group led by a mixture of archivists and blenders, and together they used as much archive material as they could to create the long lost blend of Gerston Distillery. Have a look at lostdistillery.com if you want to find out more about that, but really interesting that collaboration between the blenders who have the skill and the archivists who can find the information to create a lost blend. Nucleus also hold papers, plans and receipts for the Pulteney Distillery, which opened in 1826 and is still open today, although it closed temporarily during Wick's temperance periods in the 1920 to the 1940s, which I've done in a previous talk, so I'm not going to go into the temperance movement, but just interesting that those are the records that Nucleus hold archives for, but apparently in the late 1800s there were around 44 distilleries in that area, so just interesting to see how many have come and gone, and some of those have left no trace at all. At the same time that the Pulteney Distillery was being established, the Talisker Distillery was being set up in Skye. It was founded by Hugh and Kenneth MacAskill in 1830 after they had bought the land from the MacLeods, and I'm going to finish with just a little bit of information about Talisker. Both Pulteney and Talisker and numerous others were founded not long after the passing of the 1823 Excise Act, which I mentioned at the beginning. So that reduced the number of illicit stills and saw a boom in the creation of legal distilleries. So hundreds of legal distilleries created around this point, including Talisker. And the development of Talisker, the estate and various other distilleries was directly connected to the Highland clearances, as dozens of families were moved off the land, first of all to make way initially for sheep, but then for the distillery to be built as well. In the case of Talisker, they were moved to new townships or moved away from Skye altogether, and a few remained nearby and were given work in the estate, but many just left. And this is documented in the report of the Napier Commission. And again, I've done a talk on the Napier Commission, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but it was a royal commission set up in the 1880s with the purpose of inquiring into the state and conditions of crofters and cotters. And it's really interesting that there is a specific reference within the collection to, within the Napier Commission, there's a specific reference to the effect of the distillery's opening. So, evidence of Murdo Mackay, Bracadale. Mr. Fraser Mackintosh asked him, where did they go, the people? And he says, to every place about. Some went to America, and others were scattered about the country. Then Hugh McCaskill became tenant of Talisker, and he removed the tenants who were in Ardfrech and Gila. There would be 15 or 16 families in these two townships. Some of them went to Rogue, and some went over the way to Snizort. He then began to remove the crofters from Ferrenlee. The number of families in it was about 16. He placed some near the distillery, those who could not leave the township. My father was one of those removed from Ferrenlee. Some of them went to Unish, Waternish, and others to the island of Rum, some to Rogue and Ullinish, wherever they could get a hole to live in. So that's one extract from the report. The next one is evidence of Alexander Matheson, and he is asked, several people from the from these townships emigrated. Were they crofters or cotters? And he says, cotters. No crofters? No crofters on our side of the loch at all. And Sheriff Nicholson says, the distillery where the famous whisky known as Talisker is made is at Carbost. Yes. We heard from McCaskill that injury had been done to some of the people at the very time it was erected. Has it been of any benefit to the people? Are there many of them employed in it? There are about half a dozen people employed in it altogether. Has it done any injury to the people in the district? No, but at the time of its erection they were complaining bitterly of it, as they were turned out wholesale by the distillery to make the distillery. So interesting there, just the thing that we very much associate with Scotland and with the image of Scotland, that whisky is also intrinsically linked to something else that's associated with Scotland, and that's the clearances. Despite the uncomfortable beginnings that Talisker had at that point, it became a very, very popular whisky. It was a favourite of Robert Louis Stevenson, amongst others, who named it in a poem. But as we saw with the Pulteney distillery, the temperance movement came in the mid-1800s, and many distilleries closed or folded there or went bankrupt because it was just hard to survive that. And Talisker changed hands several times throughout the 19th century as various owners became bankrupt and the market changed. But by the early 1900s, Talisker was on a level footing and had gone on to become one of Britain's best-selling malt whiskies. It's now owned by Diageo, and it still has a reputation for being one of the finest malt whiskies that it is possible to buy. And within the collections in our Skye and Loch Archive Centre, we hold records and information relating to that distillery. So you can see, I hope, that whisky has been a thread throughout Highland history. We've seen it connected to politics, we've seen it connected to battles, wars, baptisms, work, wages, the clearances, industry reform, marketing, publicity. It's been a constant thread for hundreds of years through the story of Scotland, and I hope that some of those documents have illustrated that. I wanted to finish quickly by reading you an extract from a Lochaber police occurrence book, because I mentioned we also see whisky referred to in our police occurrence books. And this is a fantastic one from, which one is it? From Glenfinnan Police Daily Occurrence Book, where he describes, I was near Fassifern when I found a horse and cart, property of the North British Railway, crosswise on a public road. So the horse and cart was abandoned sideways in the road, and the policeman says, and then I found the driver lying helplessly drunk. I took charge of the horse and took the driver with me. He then went on to investigate, and it transpired that the whisky cask that the cart had been transporting, bound for the Glenfinnan Hotel, had been holed. So the driver had put a hole in it and then plugged it up, been drinking out of it and then plugged it up to look like nothing had happened, but the whiskey was still leaking out of it. And the driver was searched and was found to have a gimlet, which he had made the hole with, and a pint bottle of whiskey that he had filled up and kept in his pocket. So, as I say, we find these records everywhere. I hope you can join me next week. Next week we'll be looking at the subject of food for rich and poor and food for pleasure and necessity. So some of the menus that we have for large high profile events, and some of the information we have about what people were being fed in the poorhouse, in the asylum, and when crop failures happened. So all sorts of information there about the way food has changed over the centuries. So I hope you can join me for that. The other thing I wanted to say just before I go is that we will be starting a new series of classes on the 22nd of October. It would be great if some of you wanted to sign up for those and join us. For the first time ever, we have extended the classes, so we've added a class in, and also we have incorporated material from across all 4 of our archive centres. They'll be presented, some by me, some by other colleagues, so you'll get a chance to meet colleagues from across the service as well. So if you're interested in that, then you can find out more by having a look at the advert on our Facebook page or emailing us at archives@highlifehighland.com. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. I'll see you next week.